never thought I would be the person telling a story like this. I was never really into ghost stories or haunted places. I always thought people saw what they wanted to see. An old building makes a strange noise and suddenly everyone has a paranormal explanation. I was the kind of person who needed proof. That changed during one of the strangest nights of my life. A few years ago, I worked a night security shift at an abandoned carnival called Six Gun Territory. The place had been closed for a long time, but the property was still being watched because people would sometimes break in. My job was simple: walk the grounds, check the buildings, make sure nobody was inside. During the day, the place looked like any abandoned attraction. Old rides covered in rust, broken signs hanging from wooden posts, empty game booths with faded prizes still sitting behind dusty glass. But at night, the whole place felt different. The silence was heavy. You could hear every small sound: the wind moving through the trees, the old metal rides creaking, even your own footsteps on the ground. My first few shifts were completely normal. Then, I started hearing music. It always happened after midnight. A carnival song. One of those old-fashioned calliope tunes that used to play at fairs. The first time I heard it, I thought maybe there was some old speaker system still working somewhere. So I checked the control room. Nothing. The power had been shut off years ago. The wires were disconnected. There was no way anything inside that carnival could be making music. But the next night, I heard it again. Same song, same time, coming from the old dark ride. I remember standing outside that building, trying to convince myself there was a simple explanation. Maybe an animal knocked something over. Maybe the wind was moving something. Anything. But the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside. I opened the door and walked in. The moment I stepped inside, the music stopped. The darkness inside was almost complete. My flashlight barely reached the walls. Everything was covered in dust. Old ride carts, broken decorations, faded paintings. Then I noticed something on the floor. A clown mask. At first, I thought it was just another piece of old carnival junk. Then I saw the paint. The clown makeup on the mask looked fresh. Not faded, not cracked. Fresh. There were streaks of white and red paint running down the face. I remember kneeling down and looking at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This place had been abandoned for years. How could something look like it had just been painted? I reached toward it. The paint was still wet. That was the moment I stopped feeling curious. I started feeling nervous. I stood up and looked around. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Slow footsteps coming from deeper inside the ride. I called out, "Is anyone there?" No answer. Just silence. I slowly walked forward, following the sound. The farther I went, the stranger the place felt. The old carnival paintings on the walls seemed different somehow. The clown faces painted on the ride looked like they were watching me. I reached a small room with an old broken mirror hanging on the wall. And in that mirror, I saw someone standing behind me. A person wearing an old carnival outfit. A clown. I froze. I couldn't move. I turned around as fast as I could. Nothing. The room was empty. I looked back at the mirror. The reflection was normal. I didn't wait to understand what happened. I ran. I left the building, locked the door, and stayed outside until morning. When my supervisor arrived, he noticed something was wrong. I told him everything. The music, the mask, the footsteps, the mirror. He stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then he asked me something that still bothers me. "Did you find the clown mask?" I asked him how he knew. He told me that years earlier, one of the workers who operated the dark ride disappeared during a night shift. Nobody ever found out what happened to him. The only thing left behind was his clown costume and a mask inside that same ride. I quit soon after. I never stepped inside Six Gun territory again. But even now, I still think about that night. Not because of the footsteps, not because of the mirror, but because of the mask. Because when I walked away from that dark ride, I heard the calliope music start playing again. And this time, it sounded like it was coming from right behind me. I never really understood why people were afraid of abandoned carnivals. To me, they were just old places. Broken rides, empty buildings, things that had been forgotten. But there is something different about a carnival after everyone leaves. The same places that were once full of laughter suddenly feel completely wrong. This story came from a group of teenagers who decided to explore an old abandoned carnival attraction one night. They weren't looking for anything supernatural. They weren't trying to find ghosts. They just wanted to explore a place that everyone in town had been avoiding for years. The attraction they entered was called the Midnight Funhouse. It had been closed for almost 20 years. During the day, it looked like an old wooden building falling apart. The paint was peeling, the signs were faded, the windows were covered in dirt. But at night, the place looked different. The building seemed darker. The entrance moved slightly in the wind, and the broken lights hanging above the door made it look like the funhouse was still waiting for someone to come inside. The group of teenagers arrived just before midnight. They brought cameras and flashlights, laughing the whole time. They were nervous, but they didn't want to admit it. At first, everything seemed normal. They walked through the old entrance and explored the empty rooms. There were broken carnival decorations everywhere. Old signs, dust-covered props, pieces of the attraction that had been left behind. Then they reached the mirror maze. That was where things started to change. The walls were covered with hundreds of old mirrors. Some stretched your reflection. Some made you look taller.
Some made your face look completely distorted. They laughed at first. They walked around, making jokes and filming each other. Then one of them noticed something strange. A reflection moved, but it wasn't their reflection. It was someone standing behind them. They immediately turned around. Nothing. Just an empty hallway of mirrors. They looked back. The figure was still there, standing between the reflections, watching. They thought maybe another person had entered the building, so they called out. No answer. They checked the corners.
Nothing. But when they looked into the mirrors again, the reflections were wrong. One person lifted their hand, their reflection stayed still. Another person stepped backward, their reflection didn't move. Slowly, they realized something terrifying. The mirrors weren't showing them anymore. They were showing something else. Something that was inside the maze with them. They followed the strange reflections deeper into the funhouse, trying to understand what they were seeing. That was when they found something hidden behind one of the mirrors. A small opening in the wall. Inside was a space where someone had been living. There was an old blanket, empty food containers, clothes scattered on the floor. Someone had been hiding there. At first, they felt relieved. They thought they finally had an explanation. The strange movements, the feeling of being watched, the reflections. Maybe it wasn't something supernatural. Maybe someone had been living inside the funhouse. But then they saw the photographs. Hundreds of them. Pictures of people walking through the mirror maze. Pictures taken from places where nobody should have been standing. The photos showed visitors who thought they were alone. The group started backing away. And then they heard something. A tapping sound, coming from somewhere deep inside the wooden walls. Slow, quiet, almost impossible to hear. Tap, tap, tap. They stood completely still. The sound continued. It wasn't coming from the hidden room. It was coming from deeper inside the funhouse. Something was moving behind the walls. Something was following the maze. The tapping got closer. Tap, tap, tap. Then one of the mirrors cracked. The glass didn't break from their side. Something had pressed against it from behind. The teenagers didn't wait to find out what it was. They ran. They pushed through the maze, following the exit sign, while the tapping continued behind them. They never looked back. They escaped the building and locked the door behind them. The next day, they watched the footage they recorded. And that was when they noticed something they missed. Throughout the entire video, The mirrors were not showing their reflections. They were showing someone standing behind them, following them, watching them. And in the final seconds of the recording, the camera pointed back toward the funhouse. The entrance was empty. The building was silent. But inside the mirror maze, a figure was standing there, waiting, watching, like it knew someone else would eventually come back inside. I worked as a security guard in 2026. Most of my night shifts were exactly what you would expect. Quiet, boring. Just walking around empty places, checking doors, looking at cameras, and making sure nobody was where they weren't supposed to be. I was never the type of person who believed in ghosts or haunted locations. If something strange happened, I always tried to find a normal reason behind it. A noise was probably the wind. A shadow was probably a trick of the light. That was how I looked at things. Until I worked at that old carnival. The carnival had been shut down for years. It used to be a place where families came, kids played games, and people spent their weekends. But by the time I was there, it was nothing but an empty piece of land. The rides were gone. The old booths were falling apart. The signs were faded and covered with dirt. The company I worked for was hired to watch the property because people had been getting inside at night. My instructions were simple. Walk the grounds. Check the buildings. Make sure nobody was trespassing. When I arrived for my shift, the first thing I noticed was how quiet the place was. There was nothing around. No traffic. No nearby houses. No lights in the distance. Just an abandoned carnival sitting in the dark. The entire property had been disconnected from the power grid years earlier. There was no electricity running to the old attractions. No working lights. Nothing. For the first few hours, everything was normal. I stayed in the security office, checked the cameras, and walked around the property every hour. Around 2:30 in the morning, I started another patrol. I passed the old rides, the empty food stands, the broken game booths. Everything looked the same as it had before. Then, I noticed something that made me stop.
The old ticket booth was lit up. A small light inside was flickering. At first, I thought I was seeing things. I stood there looking at it, trying to understand. That booth had no power. I knew that. I had been told the entire property was disconnected. There was no reason for that light to be on. I slowly walked toward it. The closer I got, the stranger it felt. The ticket booth looked exactly like the rest of the carnival. Old, damaged, forgotten. The windows were covered in dust. The wooden counter inside was cracked. Everything looked like nobody had touched it in years, except for that light. Then, I saw someone standing behind the window. I stopped. There was a person inside.
For a second, I thought maybe someone had broken in. But something about the person looked wrong.
They were wearing an old carnival worker uniform. Not something modern. It looked like it came from another time. They were standing completely still, just staring at me. I raised my flashlight. The figure slowly lifted their hand. They were holding a ticket, an old paper carnival ticket. They pressed it against the glass. I remember just standing there, confused. I wasn't thinking about ghosts. I was thinking, how did someone get inside? The door was locked. The windows were sealed. There was no way anyone should have been in there. The figure tapped on the glass. Once. Then again. I looked away for a second. When I looked back, they were gone. That was when I started feeling uneasy. Not because I saw someone, because I didn't know where they went. I stepped away from the booth. Then I heard footsteps coming from the darkness behind it. Slow footsteps. Someone walking through the carnival. I turned my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. I called out. No response. A few seconds later, I heard it again. Closer. That was when I stopped trying to figure it out. I walked back toward the security office as fast as I could.
Behind me, I could hear movement between the old rides. I didn't look back. I locked myself inside the office and called for help. While I waited, I checked the cameras. The ticket booth was still visible. The light was still on. But this time, the camera showed something else. A figure was standing outside the booth, facing the security office, watching. The police searched the property when they arrived. They didn't find anyone. No signs of an intruder. No broken fences. Nothing. But near the ticket booth, they found an old carnival ticket lying on the ground. It was faded and worn out. The date printed on it was from 1974. I never went back to that carnival after that night. I still don't know who was inside the ticket booth. I don't know who was walking through the darkness behind me. But I know what I saw. That ticket booth had no electricity, and there was no one who should have been inside.